Yeah, so welcome everyone. This is the session Decision Making for Others. I'm very happy to see a very high quality group of people to present, an equally high quality group of people to discuss. Very excited about this. I'm not going to take away a lot of this very restricted time that we're having. I'm just going to hand over to our first presenter, Sascha Füllbrunn, and just say the floor is yours. You've got 17 minutes and then we switch to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Wolfgang. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Can you see my screen? I guess you can do so. You can?
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, this is joint work with Wolfgang, obviously, Privatizing Gains and Social Losses Agency under Accountability. And what is going to happen in recent time, or what many people feel, is that there are some people who are only winning on the upside, but are not taking the downside risk. So this is a quote from Stiglitz from 2010 already. Today, most of the big companies, you have managers who, when things go well, walk off with a lot of money. When things go bad, the shareholders bear the cost. So you socialize the losses and privatize the gains. And he's not the only one who's complaining about that. Also, Adrian Haldane, the chief economist and executive director of the Bank of England, basically says that there's a private risk of financial decision makers are not aligned with social risk. And as you can imagine, I can go along with a lot of more stories, but at the very end, the idea is that there are some people or some environments where people can actually take a lot of risk, but that the losses is not on their own account, and this might have a negative effect on others. We see it also in particular in the financial industry, and when we talk about this option-like incentives, so you have convex incentives or limited liability incentive, is that the reward good performance but does not penalize the bad outcomes, and this incentives kind of foster asset market bubbles or might also distort asset pricing. Of course, this kind of remuneration possibilities allow for taking more risk, and this is also what many people actually want. But on the other side, this might also be detrimental depending on the different situations we consider. In this study, we consider this kind of social risk-taking with convex incentives. What we do is basically we compare the situation where people are limited liable, have this convex incentives, or in a situation when they are not liable. So these are our two main treatments for the later experiments called LIM and others.
So we're still seeing your title slide, just so you know.
Oh, I was on the screen, sorry. So, and the second question is then when we look at this kind of preferences, whether accountability actually mitigates this excessive or this additional risk-taking. And in the third question, we look at whether there are correlates for this kind of higher risk-taking, which is related to greed or social value orientation. We are in a session where it's about decision-making for others, and therefore you all know what is going on, that the conventional theory we are already considering in economics is about people being self-interested and having no other regarding preferences. However, with respect to behavioral finance and behavioral economics, we know that this is not the case, so that these models might not necessarily work in explaining how people behave in such situations. In our special issue, we have the meta study from Paul Monvaux, who basically consider the situation where people take risk for others, and the question is whether they take more or less than for others. And in this kind of literature, we see that there's barely any difference. If you look at all the studies, results are mixed. We look in a particular environment where we consider investments. So there are other environments I'm not going to detail now. And if you want to know more about this environment, we use I have also a chapter with Wolfgang and Ola together, where we look at this in more detail as an overview. In another paper in 2020, Wolfgang and I looked at the same situation. What we did is actually looked at the situation where people have the money manager who takes investment for others has a zero payment, or a situation which is limited liability, where they actually earn 5% of the client's profits, but that there's no loss involved. And what we find there is actually, when you look at the distribution of investments for up to €9, is that in the limited liability treatment, we find a lot of people who invest a lot of money for the others. And you see that when you look at the others treatment, that their distribution is much more on the left-hand side. So there we see clearly that in the limited liability treatment, where people have convex incentives, that they take much more risk for other people than they would do in a situation where this is not the case and there's a flat payment. So in this study, we look at the same situation, but now we let people know about the preferences the clients actually have. We also look at the traits, whether they explain this high risk-taking and limited liability using the dispositional greed scale, which measures the greediness of people. And on the second hand, we look at the social value orientation and compare individuals to pro-socials. But at the very end, we find no effect, and so I will neglect it for the rest of the talk. When we talk about accountability, it's about the expectation by a decision maker that she may be called upon to justify. And there are different situations where this helps, and the other situation, the results are not that clear whether this is possible. And we would like to dig a little bit deeper whether accountability reduces this higher risk-taking in the convex environment. There are other experiments in decision-making for others who look at accountability, where the results show basically that accountability reduces loss aversion to some extent, and that accountability accentuated the pre-existing risk attitudes. What people there do is usually that subject have to justify their decision to the experimenter, that there's a potential interrogation by principles, or another possibility is also that the decision maker and the principal talk after the experiment why people made a particular decision. In the limited liability environment, there are only two papers that came across who look at some kind of similar situations. In Casal et al., they find no effect. There, only the clients know the outcomes and the decision in the accountability situation, while in the non-accountability situation, they only saw the outcome. Kling et al., also with Stefan involved, the clients sent predefined messages in the accountability treatment and not on the non-accountability treatment, and they found a valid accountability effect. In our case, experimental design looks as follows. First, people make a decisions for themselves, and afterwards they make a decision for 6 clients. In the limited liability treatment, the others treatment, there were no feedback, and people only saw the investments. In the accountability treatments, this is the same situation, but now people got feedback. People the moneymaker has to justify in front of the clients, and then also saw the outcome of the investments. So what is the experimental design? People make an investment X of an endowment of €9, and then people earn either the endowment plus 2.5 times the investment with a 1/3 chance, or in case of a loss, 9 minus X, so they lose their investment with a chance of 2/3. So this is the investment for their self situation. And then after the first round, we grouped all the people. So we tried to keep a homogeneous group. So what we did is we ranked the investment for themselves, and then we built groups such that the clients all have roughly the same investment, so that you see kind of the order statistics that you can assume at least on average. So on the investment and limited liability, others, and the 2 accountability treatments, people make a decision as if they are the money manager, and only afterwards there's a random draw who of those the participants became the money manager and who became the client, so for whom the investment finally was made. So the payments thus is that when there is a success, then the money manager get no additional payment, while the client gets a 9 plus a 2.5 times the investment. And in a failure, the money manager got 0 again, and the clients lose their investment. In the limited liability treatment, what is happening is that the money manager actually earns 6 times, because there are 6 clients times 5% of the profit, while the clients get the endowment plus 0.95% of their profit. So that's basically less than 5% that the money manager gets. When there's a failure, then the money manager gets nothing, and the clients basically make a loss of their investment. So that's the general situation. In comparison to our first paper, the money manager saw the investments of the clients, so they know exactly what the clients actually would have invested in the situation, and then you need to make a decision. Right, so that's basically the general setup. Now we come to the accountability situation, and the Micro Foundation described in Hunt and Perry. They have 5 particular points of the accountability. It's attributability, that the action can be identified; observability, that there is a presence of the audience; evaluability is evaluation of the actions; and answerability is a justification of actions. Point 5 is consequentially. So here there's actually monetary consequence for the decision maker, but this is what we basically left out in our experimental design. So what we did then is basically we took attributability and observability, so the clients see the amount invested, and the money manager learned about feedback from a chat that the clients actually could give to the decision maker. They rated their satisfaction related to availability to say, please rate your satisfaction with the investment of, in this case, 2.54 euro, from completely dissatisfied to completely satisfied. And as mentioned, there's a written feedback given to the money manager. In terms of answerability, what we did is basically that of one group, one money manager took one randomly drawn client, and they both went to a different room where the money manager had to explain what he did or why he made this choice. But this was in a secret room, so no one knows what this was about. So the instructions were common information, so we tried to make the accountability as severe as possible for our design. So our research question then is, do we still see that limited liability has higher investment than in the other treatment when the money manager observes the client's preferences? So we hypothesize that the money manager invests more in limited liability than in the others, and invests more in limited liability with accountability than in others' accountability. So this is just, as it is a 2-by-2 design, it's basically comparing the 2 treatments with or without accountability, comparing limited liability and others. And the second question is then whether accountability actually reduces this extra risk-taking people obviously take when making decisions for others in the limited liability environment. So the results regarding the comparison between limited liability and others, what we find as well as before, that we see a lot of investments here as the highest amount. So in the limited liability treatment, we have more people who invest a higher amount compared to the other treatment. And we find throughout that we have significant results, either comparing the investments for all people, or what we did in the other paper as well, splitting, making a median split of the general risk measure by Dorman et al. And there we find the same situation. So overall, our first observation concludes that independent on whether the preferences of the clients are known, the money managers take higher risk in the limited liability treatment than in the other treatment, which is similar also in results to our study in 2020. However, it seems to be a small gap, but this is not significant. And we also need to take into account that these are different subject pools. For the investment under accountability, we don't find this effect. So accountability itself seems to diminish the differences there. Now going to accountability. What we see here is the difference between a limited liability in the gray bars and the limited liability with accountability in the black bars. And what we can see as well, that the accountability investments are lower than the limited liability investment, and in particular, of course, the highest investment has decreased by half, I would say. So we overall, the results are not that entirely clear. So if we make the comparisons here, we only see a mildly significant effect, depending on the discussion. So we see a difference, but the difference is not that strong. This is stronger when we look at the higher risk group, but also if we compare the differences between the investment for yourself and the investment for the others, we see barely an effect. And if we see an effect, then only for those who take higher risk.
Sasha, you've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, generally, so if you look at the regressions, we actually find the same results. The limited liability here is a reference. And there basically we see the difference for, in particular, the limited liability with accountability, we see a drop, and also for the others, which is much stronger. So overall, we think we can conclude that accountability reduces risk taking for others when the money manager are a limited liability. So overall, what we find is that convective incentives increase risk taking for others substantially. So when you compare it to others, where other regarding preference to some extent might play a role because people invest moderate or basically invest the money of others rather moderate, we find this effect disappears when limited liability is at its place. So in that situation, the investments increased tremendously. And in a recent experiment in Prolific, we did this for a different size of people. So this is investment for 1 person, 5, 10, 20, 50, or 100 people. And there we see that there's also significant difference comparing decision-making for others with a flat payment or with a limited liability environment. Our elicited traits played no role. Accountability reduces risk-taking for others, as mentioned before. The paper from Stefan and co-authors, they have a likewise experimental design. They don't find this effect or not. There's no significant effect. There's also some tendency towards the results we find as well, but they have a different design. I'm not going to go into details now more. So generally, the convex incentives are sufficient to increase risk-taking for others. And so there's the tendency to say, well, these are financial professionals. So these are the alpha men, people who like to take more risk and are sufficiently greedy, as mentioned in the media, to take the risk and to take the socialist. However, in this experiment, we see that even in simple experiments with just a slight incentive to take risk for others, the investments explode. And from that perspective, the incentives play quite a strong role, even though you might be greedy or not greedy. Their accountability, so the literature and experiments regarding accountability called us different accountability aspects. We basically bundle all of them to make it as severe as possible. However, to better understand what accountability aspects play a more dominant role, I think that experiments in the future should disentangle those and what combination of those accountability aspects might play the best role. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. You're almost on time, like 1 minute over. I'll hand over to the first discussant, John. Just go ahead, please start your discussion.
Great, thank you. Well, I really enjoyed reading the paper and thinking about it, and it's clearly an interesting question, and it really brought me back to 2007 and the financial crisis and all the intermediaries and all of their behavior and their limited liability. Which raised one fundamental question to me, which is what is the proper counterfactual for your limb and lack treatments? I mean, you use what we've called in our papers decision-making simpliciter, or unincentivized decisions made by one individual on behalf of another. But when I think a lot about 2007, one of the things I think is that the intermediaries were happy to process questionable investment vehicles because they had no skin in the game. So, one question is what's the proper counterfactual? And in your case, it's these decision makers who have no skin in the game, and should they have had upside and downside risk? And I know you've already run the experiment, but maybe for a future experiment, that's something you could think about. Another thing that struck me was that the LIM or limited liability decisions really looked distinct to me from all the other treatments, the other, the LAC, and the OAC. So I'd be interested to see whether or not really it's only the LIM decisions that are different than the other decisions. And Sasha, you mentioned in your presentation, the incentive was small, just 5%, and created this huge shift in behavior. And then, accountability appears to completely undo it. So, and you sort of mentioned, but it would be interesting to know which mechanism of accountability maybe had this effect. And also, the people knew they were going to be held accountable, but the accountability information was only shared with the subjects after they made the decision. So it's pretty, I'm interested in how the accountability mechanism worked, given that they hadn't gotten the feedback yet, at least if I understand the experiment correctly. To answer some of this, I thought I'd like to see more within-person comparisons, because you have all the individuals' own decisions for themselves. And from that, you might be able to get some sense of their preferences. I know you shared it with the subjects when they were making decisions on behalf of others, but you could also, I think, use it more in your analysis. I know you have that shift measure, which you didn't talk a lot about today. But maybe you could put the IND decisions into figures 2 and 3, or maybe you could put that in an appendix. In table 4, you can control for the individual's decisions and the regressions. And one thing I just noted in table 2 is it looked like the IND decisions for the LAC and OAC treatment were different. So you should check that all of your treatments, the priors were the same in IND, because it looked like maybe they weren't just looking at the table. And also you talked a lot about the literature on risk taking for others. And as you mentioned, like there's that paper by Pullman and Wu that shows that in a meta-analysis, there's no clear direction. But here you clearly find a ton of risk taking in DMFO, or for decision making for others, and the upside's small. So, I just was surprised by the size of the shift. And is there any way to sort of back out risk preferences based on your data? So estimate a risk preference parameter using the data you have. And then of course the question is, well, how do you reconcile this large shift with the absence of a shift largely in the literature? It looked like you didn't measure risk-taking preferences in DMFO. But it would have been nice to have that, the individual's risk-taking preferences for others. Wolfgang, where am I on time? I'm sorry.
You're actually exactly on time right now.
Okay, I have some minor points which I'll share with you two via email as well. I'll send you my notes. So anyway, I thought it was interesting to think about, and thank you for the interesting paper and presentation.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thank you. Sasha, you want to comment very briefly on anything that John raised, or should we?
So I think one point maybe. So actually, in our first paper, we had the individual decision as included in the regression. But as we use the shift as a dependent variable, then we would have the own decision in the dependent variable and in the independent variable. And the referees in the first shoot we did basically mentioned that it's not a good idea, which is the reason we then finally only did the Dorman et al. Standard our risk general risk question, and that's what we then used as a risk preference parameter. But for the limited liability, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. It doesn't matter whether you are did it first or last. It doesn't matter what risk preference you have or whether you are, and so on and so forth. This all doesn't matter. It just shows in limited liability this incentive is just enough to change it. And in the first paper, we had a situation with 50% bonus, so which is actually a negative expected payment for the clients. it doesn't matter. I mean, the risk is just as high as with 5%. We didn't carve out more in a different study whether 5, 10, 20, or 30% play a stronger or less strong role. We think we didn't find it sufficiently interesting, but maybe Georgia is doing something in that direction. So we will see. But thank you very much for your comments. I don't know whether there's a further question.
I was going to ask whether there are any more questions also from the other attendees. Just to remind you, you can always raise your hand so I can unmute you, or type it in the question and answer panel. We didn't have any questions so far. Also a reminder, this channel will stay open for half an hour after the session. So if anything we don't come to right now, we can discuss later on. So going once, going twice, any questions? Okay, then.
Clear in the direct chat that this is now has to finish to have the next.
I've just to you. Okay, then we'll move on. Thank you very much again, Sasha, for this great paper. I wish I was part of it. The next presenter in our session is Cyril Bosch-Rosa. I'll just hand over to you, Cyril, to share your screen. Great, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Now, okay, good. So first of all, let me use some of my precious time to thank Wolfgang and Sasha for organizing. You know, fantastic to talk about this. It's also great that you put me behind Sasha, because he basically set the floor for the paper I'm going to present. This is a paper on motivated beliefs in financial decision making. I have a series of papers looking at this. So, you know, yeah, so I recommend you to read all of them if you have any open questions. Okay, so, okay, so this is basically what Sasha said. Excessive risk taking is something that we care about in financial markets. This happens. This has been a problem that was very clear in the last recession. You know, it seems like limited liability plays an important role on firms and whatever money investors to take excessive risk. Now, this is a very, let's call it economic reasoning. This is, the incentives are wrong. Yeah, so this is the approach, and the incentives are wrong. These people have incentives to take excessive risk because they only take the upside and they don't take the downside. However, there might be another rationale. I'm not saying that it's either or, it's most likely a complement. And this is a behavioral aspect to investments. And it has to do with cognitive dissonance and motivated beliefs. Now, you might ask yourself, what are cognitive dissonance? What are motivated beliefs? What are you talking about? Well, let me give you a description of what I mean. Cognitive dissonance is some sort of mental uncomfortability, let's call it, discomfort. And this takes place when I have two conflicting views that are happening at the same time. Let me give you an example. I have it down here. One is smokers. Smokers, you know, you enjoy smoking, so you smoke, but at the same time, you really don't want to have cancer, right? You do whatever it is possible to not die. So smoking seems like it will clash with this idea of not dying from cancer. So what is a solution that your brain comes up with under these situations of discomfort? Well, you're doing something that clearly is bad, but then you want to avoid getting this cancer. So what do? I modify my beliefs. I form motivated beliefs that somehow ease this tension. And I convince myself that, you know, actually smoking is not that bad. I might think of this grandma that is 100 years old that lived in perfect health and smoked every day. So I form these sort of stories. I somehow mold the clay of my beliefs to fit my story that smoking is not that bad after all. Now, how does this relate to financial investment? It relates in the following way. You know, these are theories that have been brought through by Barberis, Benabou, Tidol. This is a whole literature that they have been writing for a long time now. And the idea is the following. Look, I'm an investor. I know I have limited liability, so I know that the incentives are such that if I invest more, I likely make more money because I take the upside, but I don't take the downside. At the same time, I think that I'm actually a nice person. I'm not a crook. You know, I'm an upstanding person and I'm valuable to society. And what I'm doing is actually bringing money to my clients. I'm not abusing my clients. I'm actually doing them a favor. I might even be working for too cheap. I should charge them 4% and not 2%. Yeah, so this is the idea. I can make more money by investing more, but I am also someone that does this in a professional way. And I am a person that is really, you know, abiding for the laws and doing the best for my clients. So how can I reconcile this tension that more investments or more risk taking will not lead to, you know, not abusing the system? Well, it's very simple. I just convince myself that the investments are not risky. You know, this investment I'm doing, where I'm putting all of the money of my client, it's a fantastic investment. It's a great investment. I'm not being a crook. I'm actually making a sound investment. Sometimes it comes out bad, but anyone in its right mind would make this investment. So this is the idea behind motivated beliefs. I convince myself as an investor that the investment that I'm making actually makes sense. It's less risky than I would think if I were investing my own money. So traders involuntarily underestimate the riskiness of their investments. Yeah? Traders are actually going to make an assessment of these investments that is different when they are investing their own money than when they're investing somebody else's money. They are going to assess the same investment differently when there's limited liability than when there isn't. And this is going to be the crux of our paper. This is actually going to be sort of the difference also with Sasha's approach, because what we are going to do is we're going to give them ambiguous investments. So it's not going to be a return 1/3, 2/3. We're going to allow for space to form their own beliefs. Yeah? So let me, so the research question is going to be, does limited liability affect investors' beliefs? Yeah, so do investors form motivated beliefs when limited liability is present? Okay, so let's look at it. What we're going to do is we're going to present subjects with time series representing stocks. These are going to be the returns for 6 different companies. We're not going to tell our subjects what companies are these. We're just going to tell them, look, these are companies that come from the DAX 30. These are going to be German subjects, so they sort of know what the DAX 30 is. We give a brief explanation of what it is. And we're going to show them data that covers, 13 years of returns, and there's going to be a blank for the last 2 years. So they're going to see these different companies, they're going to see these different processes in a sense. And they're not going to see this. They're not going to see BMW, Daimler, Telecom. They're going to see one screen with this return, and we're going to tell them, look, these are 14 years. And please tell us for each one of these, so we're going to show them sequentially. Yeah, so for each one of them, we're going to ask them, please tell us the likelihood that this stock will go down in price 2 years from now. Yeah, so we're going to tell them from here to here, tell us the probability that the stock goes down in price. Then we're going to ask them, please give us an estimate of the price of the stock. So give us a point estimate of the price that you think the stock will be in 2 years. And then finally, for each one of them, we're going to endow them with 10 euro, and we're going to tell them, invest as much as you want in this stock, and you will get paid whatever you invested times the price increase or the price decrease. Whatever you don't invest, you basically keep safe in a risk-free asset, and you just get after the experiment. Beliefs are going to be incentivized. We're going to use a binary scoring rule. They're going to be paid, independently so that there's no portfolio effects. So we're going to have a design in which we're going to sort of control for all of this. Now the key point here, so these are the screens. The key point is going to be here. What is control? What is treatment? So in each session, we're going to have 3 of the graphs are going to be in control and 3 of the graphs are going to be in treatment. We're going to, again, mix all of these graphs. Yeah, so all of the graphs are either in control or in treatment. In control, subjects invest their own money. So they're shown a process, and then we ask them, please, tell us a probability that it will go up, tell us the price at the point estimate, and invest how much you want of these 10 euros. The payoffs are going to be such that if there's any gains, you get the gains. If there's any losses, you absorb the losses. In treatment, we're going to divide subjects into bankers and clients. Subjects are going to know they're a banker or a client. They're going to know that they're going to be a banker for each of the 3 decisions in treatment, that they're a client for each of the 3 decisions in treatment. And then in this case, we're going to tell them, please invest this money. This is sort of, so you are the banker, you get the 10 euro, and you're going to invest 10 euros of a client. If you get profits from this investment, you split the profits 50-50. If there's losses, then the client takes all of the losses, the banker has no losses. So let me repeat this. Maybe I should. Here, if you want a math version of it, if you're a banker and there's losses, you just keep the 10 euro that you were endowed with. The client loses any losses, so absorbs fully all of the losses. But if there's profits, the banker gets its 10 euros plus half of any profits. The client gets half of the profits. Yeah. So this is sort of the design.
They really have got 5
Question?
minutes. You've got 5.
Okay. Good. So then let me use these 5 minutes for my results. This is pretty straightforward. 218 subjects is what you should care about here. Okay, so these are the investments. So in this graph, what I'm showing you basically is for each one of the graphs. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're going to have in control this pale whatever color, in treatment this for treatment this darker color. So what we observe here basically is that for the equivalent graph, whenever there's limited liability, you invest more. Yeah, so these are only investments for bankers. So these are the guys that had limited liability and were investing for others. And these are the investments for everyone else. So for the same graph, but in sessions in which this graph was in control and not in treatment. So big difference. I'm not going to show you the statistics, but it's a wash. Whenever there's limited liability, subjects invest more. What about beliefs? Okay, so here it gets less clear. Yeah, so here, remember, we're going to ask subjects, hey, for each stock, do you think there's going, what's the probability of a loss? And you can see that the differences don't seem to be very big. In fact, they're not. This is a treatment. You can see that there's a tendency to say that the loss, it's less likely that there will be a loss in treatment than in control, but it's not super clear. For the price expectations, we have these outliers that really compress the graph, but it's basically the same story. We're going to have, in prices, it's a little bit clearer. We're going to have expectations that are higher in treatment. So for the same graph, bankers, when there's limited liability, will tell us that the price expectation is higher than in control. Now, this is not super clear from the graphs. So do we actually have an effect? And this is a summary of the whole paper in one table. As a dependent variable, we'll have the expected price, the probability of losses, and the investment. And this is what we care about. So what we said, investment, highly effective treatment. You basically invest much more when you have limited liability. For loss probabilities, we see no effect, really no effect. So we ask you the probability of a loss, treatment control, the same story. However, when we ask you about prices, what we see is that subjects report higher expected prices when there's limited liability and where it's not. And this goes in line with our hypothesis that they form motivated beliefs. In fact, what we think is interesting here is that in the presence of limited liability, subjects form motivated beliefs, but they form them in an asymmetric way. So while they do not expect less losses, they expect higher returns. Yeah, so they become more optimistic, but not less pessimistic. Yeah, so they increase only, they keep the lower bar, but they increase the upper bar. Yeah, so sorry for rushing through this. The conclusion of our paper is that limited liability significantly increases the level of risk-taking of investors. We saw this in the graphs, we saw this in the statistics. And what is more interesting, pushes beliefs in the expected direction. That is, subjects become more optimistic about the same investment when they have limited liability than when they do not. And we reason that this is because they need to self-explain, to self-justify excessive risk-taking whenever there's this client taking care of the losses. And I hope I am on time.
You're actually ahead of time. I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. Over to the thanks for the great presentation. I'll hand over to the discussant, Stefan Trautmann. Stefan, just start your discussion, please.
Cyril, can you stop your slide sharing? Okay, thanks. So yeah, it was a pleasure to read the paper. It was a very clear paper on motivated beliefs and limited liability, or limited liability inducing motivated beliefs by Cyril. So the idea is indeed, so you invest other people's money, you have success dependent fees, limited liability. So if you have your true beliefs, say, if you invest for yourself, if the investment is good for yourself as an investor, as an advisor, yes, but for the other, so for the client, it would not be good, right? So this is a conflict of your self-image. So you might be inclined, or maybe subconsciously, change your beliefs. So you have these biased beliefs, and under the biased beliefs, it's good for yourself as the investor advisor, and it's also good for the other, so for your client, right? So that would be the idea, and that's very intuitive, I think. And so the design is very neat. So you observe beliefs in self and other, you observe investment in self and other, very clear design, incentivized beliefs with a binarized scoring rule, careful counterbalancing. So that's all very, very nice. I liked it. It was also very clearly described in the paper, everything. So the results, so as you described, so there's a very small effect of limited liability on beliefs, only for the expected price. There's no effect for the expected probability of a loss. The effect on expected price is not present in the raw beliefs, but including controls. So you have a small effect of approximately €3 given a global mean of 115. And then there's this huge effect of limited liability on investment. So 50 to 100% increase, a very clear effect of belief on investment. So what I was wondering is then, so it seems motivated beliefs exist, but are they irrelevant? So one thing is obviously that we think, okay, so I'm investing for the other. So I'm investing in a very risky way, and I have to motivate, justify the thing to maintain self-image. So, and then the question is whether this, well, so here's this example, right? So this is the second asset. It's perceived not so positively, so in both conditions, but with a treatment, so people invest 50%, otherwise very little. So can I really justify my action right? So can I really justify this huge investment, or can this difference be justified mentally? Cognitive dissonance reduction with this small change in belief. So I didn't really see what to make of it. And also, so in a sense, if you need these motivated beliefs to maintain this, or to reduce this dissonance and maintain the ability to invest a lot here, so that cannot work. So it cannot really explain anything, I have the feeling. So I was just wondering, so you find a significant effect, but it seems basically economically irrelevant. So maybe you can comment on that. So that was my main point. So the experiment is nice, the design is very clear, there is a tiny effect, but it seems to me the motivated beliefs do not matter based on these data. Thanks.
Perfect. So thank you, Stefan, for the nice words, and I fully agree with your comment. So that leads me to ask all of you to read my second paper on this. So the problem that we have in this experimental design is that we get very noisy data that we learn from this. This is the first sort of experiment that we run. We get very noisy data. The spread of people's predictions of prices and of beliefs are all over the place. Yeah, so I have another paper with Frank Heinemann and some other co-authors, and in which we look at a more controlled environment. We basically, it's a binary investment. It's a 50-50. So it's a 50. Sorry, it's a 0-1 outcome. So everything is compressed, so the data is nicer, and there we get huge effects. Yeah, and there we see that these belief effects are very big. Basically because we have a neater measure in a sense. Yeah. Let me also defend this paper. 3%, actually 1.5%. 1.5% is not much, but 1.5% when, I mean, here I might be doing a grandiloquent statement. 1.5% in finance realm is a lot. 1.5% in the lab is not so much. So I agree with you that the effects that we detect are small. I don't know if they're economically relevant. They don't seem to be the end of the world. They point in the right direction. We confirm it in an independent experiment. So it seems like this is something that there is and that we should care about. The answer, this is sort of the message. I agree with you, the effects are small. The data is unfortunately very noisy. But there is an intuition of this effect. This effect is confirmed in another paper. So I would still think it is something we have to care about.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions, any other comments? Again.
Anyone? So Levent, I saw you first.
Hey, so thank you very much for this very nice presentation. Very interesting study. I have just one question that I didn't understand. That's what in the regression table, I saw the number around 1,000 participants. The N was around 980, and you mentioned that you had 300 something participants. I just wanted to understand what I didn't understand.
Yeah, let me do my best. This is, I don't know if I have time to look at it. So let's do the math in our heads. We have 200 something subjects. We have 6 decisions. That's 1,200. Yeah. So let's, yeah, your take.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
So sorry, for the sake of time, so Sandro, you also have your.
Just as a suggestion, when I worked on belief updating a little bit, and so I looked into the papers about biased belief updating in general, and there seems to be a pattern, which is that if you have people update about something like their IQ or something that is really ego relevant to them, you find quite asymmetric updating. But there are also a couple of papers that are much less well known that try to, if state A is the true state, then you get $100. That basically try to induce preferences for a state. And all of those papers don't find anything. So that kind of fits with the small effect you're getting. So I would suspect that if you ran your experiment with financial professionals that have an ego relevance to making the right recommendations or investments, you would find much larger effects. Yeah, so this is perhaps one of the rare cases where what you find in the lab might be quite different from what you find with professionals.
It's a very good point.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Matteo, I'll give you the option. You want to spend ask a question now? It goes off your presentation time.
Okay.
Now you can ask.
No, mine is just a curiosity. I noticed that some of your graphs had more white space on top and some had more white space on bottom, and seemed to me to suggest upward trend or downward trend. So my point was that don't you maybe have also some motivated cognition so that when doing for others, maybe investors were picking up these cues or pseudo cues?
So I would have to re-look at the graphs again, but all of the graphs were shifted such that the final price is at 100. Yeah, so the price at time T12 is at 100. So I would be surprised if there's a more white space. Could be that it's the effect of the presentation. Okay. I hope that's not the case. Let me say that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I'll hand actually right back to Matteo because it's his turn now. Matteo, the floor is yours. Yeah. Share your presentation and share.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Wolfgang, for setting this up. The paper is still in preparation. I hope this was not too much of a discomfort for the discussant. But of course, I look forward to all feedbacks to wrap up the paper, that it's in a good stage. So it's live for me. I think the title is quite self-explanatory. What's the general motivation for this paper? In many situations, we face moral dilemmas. And in general, I would say these are situations in which there is a conflict between some self-interest, some monetary maximization process, and other dimensions that can be ethics, how should I behave, reputation, how do I look to the others, or some self-image, how do I look to myself. And in this paper, I investigate a possible way to solve this tension. Of course, the literature is already very rich in terms of tensions like this. We have wiggle rooms, we have several strategies that people can put in place. In this paper, I would like to explore whether people delegate others to choose as a way to solve this kind of tension. So a possible solution to solve it, shift the blame to others. And somehow I see delegation as a moral wiggle room here. And I think we have many real life situations in which we can think of this. Exploitation of labor, animal welfare, waste management are some of them. In terms of literature, of course, we have a lot of evidence about the fact that people in the lab tend to not be fully honest. This is taken from the website by Abeler, Nozens, and Raymond, this website that it's a companion website to the wonderful paper they wrote. And of course, this is a meta-study, and we know that in general, in situations in which people have a possibility to privately report the outcomes of some stochastic event, they tend to lie, even though they don't lie to a full extent. So somehow this is the evidence. And of course, this is probably because people are facing this trade-off between some material benefit and some reputation concern, plus some moral cost. In terms of delegation and deception, I think this is still growing literature. These are some of the papers I identified in the literature. So there is evidence that in situations in which people can ask others to somehow cheat for them, people tend to delegate. They delegate agents to perform immoral actions. Of course, immoral actions in the lab. So it's always related to some appropriation of payoffs that are violating some deontological rule. And Erat and Kandul, they show that people delegate, and people who are delegated, the surrogate liars, tend to cheat for people who delegate them. This is confirmed also in the field by this work by Michaeledou and Rotondi, and also in the experiment by Weisel and Shalvey, we have evidence of the fact that people lie for others, even if they don't have a direct benefit. So I call this somehow altruistic lying. However, there is also this very recent paper by Buchler, Fulburn, and Luhan, and that in the lab, they find very little evidence of altruistic lying. So people don't lie for others if they don't have a real incentive. So this is somehow the background, the literature background for my research. So what are the main research questions I will address? So first one is whether people hire others to be their surrogate liars. And here I put a thumb down and a thumb up because the evidence is to be qualified. So as you will see, sometimes yes, sometimes not, but there is not a unique answer. When those who are given the opportunity to lie for others can ask for a fee to perform this kind of service, does this foster cooperation in corruption? And here the evidence is definitely no. So even if people are paid to do it, there is not an increase in this kind of surrogate lying for others. And the last questions I will try to address is whether social attitudes in terms of social value orientation impact on the likelihood of being a surrogate liar. So do I lie more for someone else if I'm more an altruistic type rather than a selfish type? And yes, social attitudes seem to play an important role in the decision to lie for others. But to understand what I'm doing here, let's go to the design, because of course, otherwise it's a bit too vague. So the design is very simple. There are two players that are matched together. There is a principal and an agent, and there is a lottery. The lottery is very simple. It's a two-outcome lottery. There is either a high outcome or a low outcome, and they have 50% probability. And of course, the high outcome is larger than the low outcome. And people perform the usual die under the cap task. The private toss of a fair die and self-report. So this was a physical die in the lab, so everything was very transparent. But as usual, it's a private report. If it's an even number, they get the high outcome. If it's an odd number, they get the low outcome. So what is the main choice task of the experiment? Basically, the principal can decide whether to retain control and toss the die herself, or let the agent toss and delegate the choice. If the principal retains control, the principal faces a lottery called A. If the choice is delegated, the agent faces lottery B. And lottery A and B might be different. This is actually the main treatment of the experiment. So all the experiment relies on this difference between what I face if I roll the die myself and I self-report, or if I delegate someone else to do it for me. And this is basically the structure of the lotteries. I have 3 sets of lotteries in terms of the lottery of the agent, and 1 lottery for the principal. So lottery A, which is the one that it's for the principal, it's always the same. It's either 3 euros with probability 50% or 7 euros with probability 50%. Of course, when I say probability, I mean in case you truthfully report the outcome of the die. While for the agent, there are 3 different lotteries that are administered randomly at the matching group level. So in 3 rounds, the agent faces one of these 3 lotteries. It can be either a B minus, in which you have 2 or 6 as outcomes, B equal or B plus. Okay, minus equal plus because basically B plus stochastically dominates, the lottery A, B equal, it's the same, and B minus is dominated by lottery A. So there is a very clear ranking of these A and B lotteries that doesn't rely on risk aversion. So it's simple stochastic dominance. So try to keep in mind these lotteries because somehow the differences in payoffs is quite important. Of course, if you cheat, you will always go for the high outcome, basically. And if you cheat as a principal, you basically can appropriate 7 all the time. But if the agent cheats for you, again, the outcome will depend according of its condition upon the lottery that it's faced. The best condition if you face a cheating agent is when you have B plus, in which you can expect to get 9. Otherwise, if you think the agent is fair, you will get 6.5 as an expected outcome. As usual, if you have any doubt on the design, that I think it's fairly simple, just stop me. I'm very happy to address any problem in any question. So this is a within treatment, because again, it's administered to agents within the experiment. Then I have also some between treatment. I have a main condition, which is human agent, in which the agent is a human, so it's a real participant. And within this, I have a fee condition and a no fee condition. So the agent always receives a fixed amount. This is always paid to the agent. And the agent will know this only at the end of the experiment to avoid any kind of inequity aversion consideration or so on. So they are told that they will be paid an amount, but they don't know exactly how much. However, before rolling the die, the agents can ask to the principal for a fee between 0 and €1. Everyone knows everything, so the agent knows the lottery B, and the principal learns the fee and can choose whether to retain or not control. And then there is a condition no fee, in which the agent is just paid a fixed amount and cannot ask for any fee. And then I have a control session in which the agent is just the computer, basically. So it's just a fair algorithm. And this is, of course, known by the principal. So the principal knows that is dealing with a fair algorithm that will report truthfully the result of the toss of the virtual die.
You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, this is just a recap. Time is running faster. Then I have some additional controls for the beliefs of the principal about the behavior of the agent. Again, it's an incentivized quadratic scoring rule, similar to what we have seen before. And then I measure some other regarding attitudes of the participants, in particular of the agents, and I use the SBO that I think everyone knows, and this classifies people into prosocial and individualist, almost 50-50, not by design, by outcome. It was run in the laboratory, in our laboratory here in Trento, the CEL. This is the number of participants, in total 226 divided by these treatments, and in total 678 observations. Not much time to go into behavioral predictions, but the idea is that basically the situation that delivers the highest outcomes is when you have a deceitful principal and a deceitful agent. This is when we expect the highest outcomes. And in particular, in this condition, in B+, which is the dominating lottery, the one with the highest outcomes, the idea is that the principal will delegate the agent, while in the other two conditions, the principal will retain control because he or she will go for the maximum amounts. So the point here, again, I will not develop a full-fledged model, but I rely on some intuition in the literature, is when is it more likely that people are honest or dishonest? So I start from the assumption that the principal is mainly driven, apart from economic motivation, by some image concerns. And the idea is that the principal wants to appear honest to herself or to some ideal observer. And the other main non-monetary motivation for the agent is my perspective, guilt aversion, the idea that the agent doesn't want to disappoint the principal. Of course, there is a huge literature here. I refer to this study by Battigalli and Dufferberg, in which they recap these kind of motivations. And again, I use the notation they use, but the intuition is that a principal who delegates, the agent implicitly signals some expectations. And in particular, when you delegate someone to roll for you in lottery B-, which is the bad lottery, you are somehow telling, I expect you to go for the bad behavior, because it doesn't make sense to delegate if you expect the other to be honest. So my hypothesis is that there will be more deceitful reports by agents in B- than in B+. B- is, again, the bad lottery, B+ is the dominating lottery. And the idea is that the payment of a fee makes this dynamic even more salient, because the fee is a sort of implicit commitment by the agent. It's a bit like in the Nisi-Duffenberg, in which you make a promise. Here you ask for a fee, and this can create a stronger commitment. And then, still drawing from the literature, the idea is that pro-social agents are more sensitive to guilt. So this parameter in the model, it's stronger for pro-social agent, and then pro-social agent will be more subject to this kind of behavior, so that they feel compelled to cheat when they are delegated. In terms of the principle here, the driver is the image concerns, and the idea is that when you delegate, you are less revealing or your bad type than when you go for straight over reporting. Again, it's a bit subtle, because if you delegate certain kind of lotteries, somehow you're sending a clear message, but still the idea is that you are masking a bit your type. Okay, this is the general framework. And now flying to results, because time is running.
Yeah, you've got 1 minute.
Okay, this is for the agents. This is in general how they report. So about 60% of the reports are for the even outcome, which is the one delivering the high outcome. But if we go for lotteries, you see that the pattern is quite different. So in B-, it's actually where people significantly over-report relative to what would be the expected reporting. So agents are likely to over-report only in the dominated lotteries. And if we go in the reports by type, this is driven by the prosocial types. Again, down here, this is B-. It's the prosocial types that are very likely to over-report for this bad lottery. So this mechanism somehow seems to be confirmed. In terms of delegation, principals delegate only for the good lottery, so the one in which dominates A. So they follow a lot monetary incentives, and they believe that the agents are honest, and actually their beliefs are generally correct. And in terms of reports, the principals are much more dishonest than the agents in terms of reporting. So the principals are more they cheat much more than the agents. This is confirmed by the regression analysis. That is just a way to wrap up what I told you. And then let's conclude. So we somehow confirm possibly that let-down aversion may induce to lie. And this is mediated by individual social attitudes, because as we saw, pro-social types are very likely to deceive in this B- lottery, that somehow it's, if I delegate you to do it for me, it's more or less explicit that I expect you to go for the high outcome and then to deceive. And in terms of principles, they also delegate only when the expected outcomes of an honest report are reasonably high. And here, if you notice, they delegate also in B+, in which even if you expect the other to be honest, still the outcome is lower than if you go for straight deception yourself. 6.5 in expected terms when you delegate, 7 when you go for straight over reporting. So the idea is that if the cost of this delegation is not too high, maybe people are willing to use it. But when it's too high, they don't. They go for straight over reporting. So thank you very much. Sorry, it was a bit fast in the end, but I hope it was not too long.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, I do what every good chair does. I'll punish your discussant, so I'll take away a minute from her. Georgia, over to you.
All right, I will do a whistle-stop tour. Okay, so I thought it was a brilliant paper. Thanks very much for the presentation. I thought it had really good real-world applications, but also I thought that the methodology was really interesting. So I don't think you mentioned it in this presentation, but I thought it was a really clever use of the strategy method, because it meant that you had essentially a full set of agent decisions as well as principal decisions, which I think some of the papers from the delegated lying literature doesn't have. So I think the ERAT 2013 paper that you mentioned doesn't have that. I thought it was also a really good use because it meant that you could avoid doing kind of repeated lying, like repeated lies, which are found to give people a higher chance of kind of lying more, because as soon as they realize they can lie, they then lie with later trials. So I thought it was a really smart way to do a within subjects manipulation in a lying paradigm, basically. In terms of the results, I thought the most interesting too, I thought it was really interesting that it was in the dominated lotteries, that it was only in the dominated lotteries they tend to overreport. I thought that was really compelling evidence for that guilt aversion kind of narrative, that essentially they only lie if they feel like they've got the implicit promise from the principal, because they've essentially given up the more efficient lottery in order to delegate. So I thought that was a really, really nice result. I thought one thing that you could have maybe highlighted a bit more is actually the fee, no fee treatment. I thought the fact that actually all of the lying disappeared as soon as you entered, and as soon as you included the fee, was actually kind of a really interesting result in itself, because it almost looked like the kind of crowding out of pro-social preferences that you'd get from the Titmus paper. And also kind of reminiscent of the moral repugnance literature, in that essentially as soon as an agent says, I am going to charge you money for me to lie for you, suddenly they're like, oh, it's one thing to lie to be pro-social for my principal, it is another to take money in order to lie. So I felt like that was also quite an interesting narrative, but I guess that wasn't particularly the ex ante hypothesis, but might be an interesting point for the discussion. Did I keep to time? Was that 3 minutes?
More or less, yes, thank you. Matteo, you want to come back?
No, I want to thank you, Georgia, very much. And yeah, of course, I was a bit self-serving, because the fee part, it's still a bit, I still need to figure out a bit the story, because the data are a bit controversial. So it's a part of the paper that's a bit shaky. But thank you very much for the comments. And yeah, as soon as the paper will be ready, if you don't mind, I will really appreciate sending it to you for having a full read of it. And yeah, thank you very much.
No, I'd love to read the paper. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation and for the discussion. I think we've got like 1 minute. So if anybody has any pressing questions, not really discussion at this point, any pressing questions, I would take these now. If there is a discussion, we'll take that later on. I don't see any hands coming up, so I would suggest there's the discussion, we do this later, and we
go to the next speaker. Wolfgang, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, see, that's the space key. So next presentation, Homa Sagame. Homa, take it away. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this great session. The work I'll be presenting today is joint with John Ifcher, who spoke earlier, and we're looking at whether decision-making for others, or DMFO, closes the gender gap in competition. So it's worth going over the original gender competition experiment in some detail because we're going to be using it. So this is the Niederle-Westerland result from 2007, where they identified the gender gap in competition by having subjects come into the lab. They were unwittingly seated in rows of 4 people that were 2 men and 2 women. And then they were given a number of different tasks. Task 1 was to sum up as many sets of 5 2-digit numbers as they could in 5 minutes. And they were told that they would be paid a piece rate of 50 cents per correct answer. Task 2 was the same summation task, but now they were told that they were only going to be paid if they did the best in their group of 4. And they would get paid $2 per correct answer, 0 otherwise. And then task 3, which is the kind of measure of competitiveness, is giving subjects the opportunity to choose between whether they want the piece rate or tournament. So they found that 73% of men chose the tournament in task 3, whereas only 35% of women chose it. And that this gap wasn't fully explained by overconfidence, risk preferences, or feedback aversion. So we'll be doing a version of this, except in the context of DMFO. So there have been a number of different projects looking at different institutional changes that affect the gender gap. So female quotas, handicaps, competing in teams, all of these increase women's willingness to pay and either close or reduce the gender gap. More similar to our paper is this Babcock et al. And Westerland and other authors who looked at volunteering behavior. And in some of their treatments, they had a third party who could decide who was going to volunteer within a group to make an investment that would benefit the whole group. And they found that women were asked to be the volunteer more often and that they were more likely to accept. And then there was this sponsorship project by Baldiga and Kaufman, where they looked at the effect of sponsoring somebody and found that that actually increased the gender gap and not diminished it. So from our own work, we did a version of the Niederle-Westerland experiment where we actually had a task where there was absolutely no agency. So they were just having like a die be tossed basically on their behalf. They weren't even pressing a button so that there was an illusion of control, and found that while there was a significant reduction in the gender gap, there was still a marginal gender gap there. Suggesting that DMFO would reduce the gender gap in competition because of this absence of the thrill or fear of being involved in the competition oneself. Then in our own work from DMFO, we found that people were more likely to make charitable donations on behalf of others, and they had an increased willingness to pay for goods on behalf of others, which means that people might be getting some sort of transactional utility from purchasing items or spending on behalf of other people. So again, there might be some kind of vicarious experience. So it's a real empirical question what the likely effect is going to be. So the main result, spoiler, is that we identify a gender gap in competition similar to previous papers in decisions for oneself, but none in DMFO. And this is driven by men being significantly more willing to enter themselves into competitions than others. So basically we find that men and women enter others into competition at the same rate that women enter themselves into competition. So that's our main result. This project was subject to 2 counts of serendipity. The first one was that when we wrote our paper up and sent it into a journal, they said, well and good, we like it, but there's another paper that's further down the pipeline that's very similar to this. And it turned out that we'd done our experiment a couple months later, they'd done their experiment and they got their paper out first. So these are very, very similar projects by Helena Forn-Wagner and co-authors. This is the only real difference that we find. We both find gender gap in decisions for oneself and no gender gap in DMFO, but they find that men and women enter others into competition at the same rate as men enter themselves into competition, whereas we found that it's because they kind of go to the female rate. So pretty interesting given the reproducibility crisis in the social sciences and the kind of big push to reproduce econ experiments. So in the language of Yan Chen's paper, this is not, it's certainly not an exact replication. Exact replications are where you're redoing exactly everything in a previous project, except changing the subject and place where it's being conducted. It's, in other words, a close replication, but obviously wasn't even intended as a replication because we did it earlier. It's what we're calling a serendipitous replication. So we've now redrafted the paper as a serendipitous replication. So a lot of the language that was used in our original draft, like the title of the paper is about nominations, we dropped to adopt their language because we're presenting it as a replication. So I'll also kind of point out places where our projects were similar and where they were different. The other count of serendipity was that we kind of landed on an interesting finding that we didn't intend to really look for. So we were doing subgroup analyses by different demographic groups and found this significant difference in the competitive preferences of Asian versus non-Asian subjects in decisions for themselves, not in DMFO. We don't really know what the source of this is because the Asian categorization was part of a race, ethnicity, demographic portion of the questionnaire. We don't know whether it has to do with country of origin or what, but we'll also be presenting those findings today, just in case it's of interest to some people. So that kind of speaks to this very large literature actually on differences between Asian and non-Asian behavior and preferences. I put that in quotes because Asian and non-Asian are idiosyncratically defined in the literature. In some cases, it means people literally in East Asian countries versus Western countries. In some cases, it means, like in our case, identifying as Asian category without knowing country of origin or location. In the interest of time, I won't go over these, but kind of most similar to our paper, there has been, or closest in spirit, there is a replication of Niederle Westerland in the adult Han Chinese population. So that's worth mentioning here. So on to our experiment. In red, I've highlighted where there are differences between our paper and the Fornwagner paper, which I call FPS just for short. So one main difference is that while we use a within subject design, they used an across subject design that had 3 treatments. So we basically have it so that every person is making a decision both for themselves and on behalf of others. We alternate the order, randomize the order in which they do it, so we can look for order effects as well. But for them, they're always doing an across subject design. So they have some people making decisions for themselves, some people as principals making decisions for others, and then some people as agents having decisions made for them. So we conducted our experiments at Santa Clara University, where John is, and at Columbia University, where Barnard is located. Where I am, we did our experiment in Otree. So we had 324 subjects, fairly evenly split between female and male. We had a number of different gender categorizations, and there were 3 gender non-conforming subjects. So when subjects came into the lab, the first thing they did was take a brief preliminary survey where they indicated their year in school, their gender, and their major. They had a list of different majors that they could choose from in broad categorizations like business and management, econ, humanities, life sciences, math, physical sciences, social sciences, or they could indicate that their major wasn't listed. They could indicate their gender from the list of male, female, gender non-conforming, trans male, trans female, or not listed. And then their year in school from the kind of standard set. Then they did tasks 1 and 2 from Niederle and Westerland, the piece rate, the tournament. And the only difference between us and Niederle and Westerland is that we did, the group was the whole session. So you win if you're in the top quartile of the whole session. This is Baldiga and Kaufman's method as well. The FPS paper stuck to the Niederle and Westerland method. So after you do the first 2 tasks, before making a choice of whether to compete or not, you receive information about yourself and a random other participant in the session who's called participant X, or in the FPS terminology, the agent. You're given their preliminary information, their year in school, gender, major, their performance in tasks 1 and task 2. And then you do the whole thing again, choosing whether you want to be paid in a piece rate or tournament way. I should also mention that for half the subjects, the order is reversed. So they're doing these decisions for themselves after doing the decision for participant X. I'm just putting it here in the in another order. Then you rank your own performance quartile in the first 2 tasks and receive information about yourself and this participant X, again, that same information that we saw before. And then you do the whole choice of tournament, not for yourself, but for participant X or the agent. Half of the subjects are assigned to having skin in the game, meaning they truly are, in a sense, principal agent relationship. So you're going to get 10% of whatever the agent gets. And then half the subjects were in what we call the DMFO simpliciter. They're not getting anything out of the payoff of the agent. The tasks 4A and 4B are these retrospective tasks. I'm not going to talk about them much today because there's not really a great deal, but that follows the Niederle-Westerland methodology. The other paper, the FPS paper, they always had skin in the game. So the principals were always being paid 100% of what their agent made. So that's another difference between ours and theirs. So then the principals are asked to rank their agent's performance in tasks 1 and 2. And then we do a standard Holt-Lowry risk measure just for the decision maker's own risk, not their risk preferences on behalf of the other person. And then at the very end, we have a quiz just asking about remembering participant X's gender. And then lastly, they take a demographic survey that has just 4 more questions: age, race, ethnicity, political views, and whether or not the subject has participated in varsity sports, which has been shown to be related to competitive preferences. So some other differences, these aren't really worth mentioning. There's just some other kind of questions that they ask, since they don't have the principals make decisions for themselves as well. They do ask principals what they would have decided for themselves. They ask what they think that the agent would have decided for themselves, etc. But they don't really use a lot of these in the analysis. They do use what one would have chosen for themselves. And we have a very analogous thing, which is what they actually did choose for themselves when they were doing the self-decisions.
Oma, you've got 3 minutes.
Okay. So the first main thing to see here is that oh, and sorry, I should just say there ends up being no difference based on order or having skin in the game. So I kind of just forget about those distinctions to show the results here. A indicates the agent, P indicates the principal. So in the self columns, which are the first 2, just note that agents and principals are the same person. It's just the decision maker. So basically what we see is in the first 2 columns, we have the gender gap in competitive preferences. It holds when we put in a bunch of all the controls for demographics for the decision maker, and all the kind of explanatory variables for why there might be a difference in willingness to compete that wouldn't be just competitive preferences. So things like one's own performance, the belief in your own performance, so how you ranked yourself, etc. So then we do the analogous thing for decision making for others and see that there is no difference to speak of. The other thing here to point out is that the principal's decision for themselves does not influence what they decide for their agent. So here we're regressing whether a subject competes in the tournament on gender, whether the decision was made by someone else in an interaction of the two, and include again these controls for performance, risk, beliefs, and preliminary demographic information. So here we see that men are less likely to compete when the choice is made by a principal than when it's made by themselves. The joint coefficient tests show no difference for women competing when the choice is made by a principal than when it's made by themselves. And the interaction term here, the female times DMFO, captures the differences in the gender gap in competition in DMFO versus decisions for oneself. So in the first column, the gender gap is marginally significantly reduced in DMFO compared to decisions for oneself. And in some, basically, what I've already mentioned before, there's no gender gap in decision-making when there's decision-making for others, and it's driven by men being less likely to compete in DMFO. Here you can see the gender gap in competition in self-decisions on the left, and in DMFO decisions broken down by the principal and agent's gender. So the coloring is the gender of the agent, and then the principal's gender is marked. So male and female principals choose the tournament at the same rates when we distinguish between principals and agent's gender as we do here, and when we don't.
Homa, you're out of time. Can I ask you to wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. So so basically this, I mean, you're more or less seeing all that there is to see here. We do all sorts of different analyses, and there's no real really big difference. The only thing I'll say here is when it comes to efficiency, we don't find that there's strong evidence that decision makers make more efficient tournament entry decisions than principals do, and we don't find any sort of negative effect of being made to compete on performance. The last thing I'll just show you for the Asian gap is this this picture. So basically you can see that these are the percentages of competition by gender and by Asian versus non-Asian status. And suffice it to say that controlling for risk preferences, controlling for all the different potential determinants, we still find this significant difference. So it seems that there is some sort of difference in competitive preferences. But again, since it wasn't something we were looking for, we don't have a great deal more to say about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand straight over to the discussant Levant Neige. Levant.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Homa, thank you very much. It was a very nice presentation and a very nice, interesting research question. Too bad that the timing was bad. So I have a couple of comments. So there are minor ones and major, some relatively major ones. So that one thing is that you already mentioned in the presentation that the task is gender neutral, but you don't mention it in the paper. So it would be good to mention that. And the second thing is that the term nomination was a bit difficult for me to grasp. So it's, I was thinking of a principal-agent relationship or a hierarchical relationship, which you didn't aim, I suppose. So that you tried to give an example in the paper, but it was not enough for me. So maybe just right from the beginning, you might make it clear what you mean by nomination. One general small comment is that there are too many footnotes and long ones. So maybe you can chuck some of them to appendix, or like it becomes difficult to read with lots of footnotes. One important referee to comment is that there are two different labs, I suppose, and it would be good to run a test or something to show that because you mentioned the genders our gender distribution is similar in the paper, but maybe in terms of behavior, you can add a test. Experimental design section could be clearer. So, for example, instead of bullet points, there can be a timeline of the experiment, because it's a within subjects treatment. It's difficult maybe to follow. Also, when you are mentioning about the steps, like for example, understanding what the task for A, for example, mean was also difficult. So maybe while explaining them, you can also point out the purpose of the experimental parts. One important, relatively more important for me, is that in the task 3B and 4B, in the skin in the game treatments, nominators can receive an additional payment of 10%. So one potential issue is that there's no loss condition here. So nominators in the real world can bear the risk of failure as well. So it relates to Wolfgang and Sasha's paper, basically. So maybe also 10% could be a small incentive. I don't know what would happen with a higher incentive. Maybe it would be significant. One small note is that you put an Holt and Lorry task, but you don't explain why you control for risk. So maybe you explain that. The tables could be, it would be easier to have some graphics in the paper and also tables within the text. It was like going back and forth is always difficult. One general note is that the protocol is just a bit complicated. So not for the reader, but maybe I'm thinking as a subject, if I was the subject. So they are invited to like think about their past performance, other subjects group performance in the case of tournament, and also nominees. So also they work on a mathematical task. The questions are not difficult, but it's cognitively demanding. So my suggestion here would be to, like, a question would be that what about having a between subject design instead of it? But obviously the other paper did that, as you mentioned. But after listening your presentation, the most important question is not these ones that I wrote before, but what will you do with this paper? Will you stick to the idea or not? So one suggestion that if I can make, is that to focus on one of, so you try to prove like what are the differences between the two papers, but maybe choosing one difference and focusing on that and collecting a bit more data on that. For example, my suggestion would be the skin in the game case, because they didn't do something like that. Maybe you can run some other treatments and focus on the loss or gains and whatever. So I think this is it from me. Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much. I was just about to cut. I'm cutting everybody off. Sorry for that, but we're running out of time. I'll have to push any general discussion to after the session in the half hour that we have got afterwards. Thank you very much again, Homer, and also Levant. And we'll move on to the last presenter, Sandro Ambühl. As always, Sandro, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Sorry. Okay, can you see this?
Yep.
And does it forward? Oh, why?
Yeah, it moves. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
no,
it's
yeah,
showing.
no.
It's showing two at once. Let me unplug this screen.
And 2 at 1 is fine. Sandro, you still here?
He unplugged the wrong one.
Exactly what happened. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry for.
And it's moving. Yeah, it's moving.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is the will of the people, a positive analysis of ordinal preference aggregation together with Doug Bernheim. The motivation is that preference aggregation is just very fundamental to collective decision-making. But how should a planner decide what is best for a group whose preferences we want to aggregate? Now, we've known since Arrow's famous theorem in the 1950s that there's no single best way to aggregate ordinal preferences. But we cannot just avoid preference aggregation simply because there's no optimal procedure. So we want to know, how do individuals then aggregate ordinal preferences? In other words, what do the people think is the will of the people? Now, why would you want to study this question? Well, there's two answers. One is that arguably there are normative implications in the sense that if you live in a democracy, then the policy decisions should reflect citizens' views. So we want to study what are citizens' views on these issues. And the second answer is that in economics, we usually make policy decisions that rely on some welfare judgments. We usually start with writing down a social objective function that we try to maximize. And it's important that our policy implications will agree with the welfare judgments that the voters support, because otherwise they will disregard these policy implications. And the paper I'm citing here by Sapienza and Singales contains an example of that. So what's the fundamental debate about how we should aggregate ordinal preferences? It started in the 18th century when Borda wrote that the conventional form of election is unsatisfactory because voters cannot give a sufficiently complete account of their opinions. And he suggested that voters must be able to rank each candidate according to his merits, compared successively to the merits of each of the others. What that means is basically, you have only ordinal information about preferences. How do you aggregate that? Well, assign a cardinal utility number to each of the preference ranks and select the option that maximizes total utility. Now to that, shortly after, Nicolas de Condorcet responded that this is not a good way to go about things, because he said, the points method of Borda confuses votes comparing Peter and Paul with those comparing either Peter or Paul to Jack, and uses them to judge the relative merits of Peter and Paul. The method is flawed because it takes into account elements that should be ignored. So basically he said, you can't aggregate preferences well by relying on these type of third option comparisons that are inherent in Borda's method. And so this is not a good way to go about things. Now, today we have a plethora of aggregation rules. So let's see what people actually do when they aggregate others' preferences. So to answer the question of what people actually do, well, we're going to invite them into the lab, have them aggregate preferences and analyze their decisions. Specifically, we're going to have 5 workers on Mechanical Turk, and these 5 workers are going to have preferences over social alternatives that I'm going to be detailed about what they are in a minute. They all affect them simultaneously. And then we have a social architect who sees the preferences by the 5 workers, and based on that preference profile, decides which alternative to carry out. And that decision is going to affect that group of 5 workers. The social architect is going to make that decision for many profiles. He knows that most of them are hypothetical, but one of them is real. He doesn't know which one it is, so he has incentives to make a serious decision on every profile. Now, here's the identification strategy, the main identification strategy of our paper. Turns out that if you don't care about the names of the people you're aggregating and you don't care about the names of the alternatives, so if you impose the axioms of anonymity and neutrality, there's 42 different preference profiles. Now, what's an aggregation rule? An aggregation rule, like say Condorcet's rule, simply tells you for each of the 42 preference profiles that I'm listing in the columns here, which option you should choose on that profile. For instance, in the leftmost column, you should choose alternative A. Now, for other for other rules, say Borda's rule, Borda's rule tells you to make a different selection across these profiles. Now you can see that each of these theoretical rules generates something like a fingerprint, right? Now, what do our subjects do in the lab? Well, they too see a sequence of profiles. For each of them, make a decision and thereby generate an empirical fingerprint. Now, if we want to see what theoretical rule best describes how individuals aggregate, well, we're going to compare an individual's fingerprint to all of the theoretical fingerprints and match the individual to whichever theoretical fingerprint fits the individual's decisions most closely. So that's going to be the main identification strategy. Now, let me get into the details of the experiment. So the workers, what they're going to have to do is complete one of these 5 tasks. Each worker receives $15 and their task is their preferences are about which of these tasks they want to complete for the $15. They give us a ranking of their preferences over these tasks. We ask for that ranking in an incentivized way, but we make sure that people cannot strategize. We say with 5% chance, whatever you're doing here is going to be implemented. With the remaining 95% chance, which task you're going to complete is going to be determined in some other way, but we're not telling you how, so there's no way you can strategize even if you want to. Now, who we're really interested in are the social architects. The social architects are going to decide on these task assignments. They're going to decide who completes which task in this group of 5 workers. So an assignment might be this simple triangle here, in which worker 1 does the image labeling, worker 2 does the Twitter hate speech filtering, and so forth. The social architect observes the worker's preferences over task assignments. So this is a screenshot that I'm showing you here, and we have 3 assignments represented by these 3 geometric symbols. Now, each vertical bar is a worker, and whichever symbol is listed on top, that's the assignment that specific worker prefers most. The assignment on the bottom is, or the symbol on the bottom is the assignment that worker prefers least, and so forth. So the social architect observes the preference profile and then chooses an option. He does that for 18 different preference profiles. One of them is the real one, and for that one, the decision will be carried out. So whatever gets decided there will determine which of the 5 MTurk workers will have to complete which task. We make it as easy as possible for people to process these preference profiles. We let them drag and drop things, shuffle things, hide any part of it. And we also make sure that our results don't depend on the particular way of displaying preference information. So we have 2 variations of that, which arguably exhaust all possible ways of presenting these preference profiles to people. Okay, so I'm going to show you, and by the way in which we present the profiles doesn't really matter for our results. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Let me go to the data. I'm going to show you the data from 405 subjects in the role of social architects. And so 1 in 4 of them was matched with a group of 5 MTurk workers each. So we have a lot of MTurk workers completing tasks. Now, the data are not from a representative sample. I'm going to show you results from representative samples later on. They're going to be very similar to what we have here. So first, we want to know, what aggregation criteria do people follow when they aggregate ordinal preferences? So we're going to implement the matching strategy, the fingerprints matching strategy that I've talked about before. First, I have to tell you, though, about the rules that we're trying to assign people to. There's 3 categories. One category are based on the Condorcet rule. The Condorcet rule simply says, if you have 3 or more options, and you have to pick the best one, run a pairwise maturity vote between all pairs of alternatives. And if you have an alternative that wins all these pairwise votes, that's the overall winner. Condorcet winners don't always exist. That gives rise to the class of Condorcet extensions, but all of them do select the Condorcet winner if there is one. The next class, which is going to be the most important class in our setting, is the scoring rules. So these are generalizations of Borda's rule. So how do you aggregate ordinal preferences according to Borda? You assign cardinal utilities to the preference ranks. So say the most preferred option gives 1 point, the least preferred option gives 0 point, and the middle option gives S points. We're going to sum up the points of each alternative across all the subjects, and whichever alternative has the highest total is going to be selected. Now, if S is a half, that's the literal Borda rule, but there's also other well-known scoring rules. For instance, the plurality rule, where S is equal to 0. In that case, the only thing that counts is which alternative is most preferred. And whether you get your second most preferred or your least preferred option doesn't matter. The polar opposite of that is the anti-plurality rule, where the only thing that matters is whether or not you get your least preferred option. So that's what we get when S equals to 1. It's basically the idea is that everybody has a negative vote that they can use to vote against their least favorite option, and the alternative with the smallest number of votes against it will be selected. Now, you can interpret this parameter S that characterizes the set of scoring rules as something like a preference for compromise, right? If you set S equal to 0, the only thing that counts is whether somebody gets their most preferred option. So that's very little preference for compromise. Whereas if you set S equals to 1, you pay a lot of attention to make sure that people don't get their least preferred option. So that corresponds to a strong preference for compromise. I'm going to skip the third class of rules. Instead, I'm straight going to go to our main results graph.
And Sandro, you've got 3 minutes left.
Okay, so let me mention, we can all, no, let me not mention the malevolent rules. We have a way of detecting whether people want to harm rather than help the group of people they're assigned to, and it turns out that almost nobody wants to do that. We find very few people who are assigned to a Condorcet type of rule. Almost everybody in our sample is classified to one of these scoring rules. So they very much side with Borda, not with Condorcet. And within the class of scoring rules, you can see that plurality, every person one vote, has very, very little support. Instead, the rules that have a lot of support are the Borda rule and the anti-plurality rule. And almost everybody who isn't at one of these modes is between them. So that means that people generally act as if they use a concave utilitarian social welfare function. So they think it's more important that people don't have to live with their least preferred option than they think it is that people can live with their most preferred option. So these concave, the use of these concave scoring rules, that's one of our main results. And it turns out the classification we get is very good. Let me, instead of going into the details about this, let me tell you about all the other things we did. So this is about maybe 10% of the paper. One thing, one question that poses itself is, we fit people to a pre-specified set of rules. But there's a possibility that we forgot some rule, or that the theorists forgot some rule, and people actually aggregate according to a rule that nobody ever thought of. Well, if that's the case, then in our data, we should see a lot of people who behave similarly to each other, but dissimilarly to any of our pre-specified rules. Now you can detect such clusters of individuals using standard clustering algorithms, which we do, and we find that there's nothing that we omitted. So the theoretical rules, they encompass basically everything that people are actually doing. Another thing we're doing is we test for context dependence, because the question is, does it even make sense to study how people aggregate? It doesn't if the aggregation procedures vary widely across settings. So we have one other setting in which people, instead of aggregating preferences about task assignments, they aggregate preferences about which of the 5 biggest Swiss political parties will receive a donation of 30 francs that cannot be split. What we find, so what I'm showing you here is the difference between classifications in the political and the work domain. So we find that people aggregate a little more convexly in the political domain. So they now put a little bit more weight on making sure people get their most preferred option and a little less on making sure they don't have to live with the least preferred option. But overall, there's a lot of structural stability. We can do out of sample prediction exercises. We can classify people in one context, predict what they'll do in the other context, and that prediction does very well. Let me skip this. Instead, let me tell you how we also checked robustness to subject pools. Our Swiss sample isn't representative, so we did our study both in the US and in Sweden. We selected these countries because they're quite different in terms of their welfare systems and in terms of how majoritarian their political culture is. Now, here the chooser preferences to be aggregated are which of 4 international charities will receive a donation of $20. Now, what you can see is that there's the blue dots are the US subjects and the red dots are the Swedish subjects. I'm showing you the outcome of the classification. And you can see that there's almost no difference across these 2 countries. And they're also quite similar to our lab sample. So the results seem to generalize across a bunch of populations. And in fact, you know, you can say, and this is a different project, this is not the one with Doug, but we replicated this experiment with 400 German state and federal parliamentarians. So the idea is that, well, ultimately, actual decisions are implemented by politicians, not by citizens. So let's run the experiment with actual politicians. And they too aggregate in very similar ways to our lab subjects and our general population samples. They also really like the concave scoring rules. Additionally, what we see from them is that the interpretation of the scoring rule parameter as a preference for compromise factor seems to make sense. If we rank, or if we plot the mean scoring parameter we estimate for our politicians, if we plot that against their political party position, you can see that the more centrist parties tend to have higher scoring parameters. They have a higher preference for compromise than the parties on either extreme.
Sandro, you're 3 minutes over time. I have to stop you now. I'll give you 10 seconds. Okay. I'll give you 10 seconds to wrap it up, and then we go to the discussion.
That's all. Let me just. Why do we do this? Policies should reflect people's welfare criteria, and when we do economics, we should use the welfare criteria people like. Otherwise, they're going to disregard the results of our analysis. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Bernhard Gangelmeier for the discussion.
Thank you. Doug and Sandra asked their subjects in the lab subjects how much they know about social choice theory, and I was putting myself in their shoes for a moment. So before reading their paper, my answer would have been meh, a little bit from grad school. Condorcet, sure, I've heard that. Border rule, let's just say yes. Now, after reading their paper, though, things are different. So you get a really wonderful paper, a good refresher on social choice theory, also a little bit on the history. So for everybody on the panel, I know this paper is already on your reading list, so don't kick it off the reading list, take a look at it. And for everybody still in the audience, read the paper, it's a wonderful read. Skip the 80-page appendix, this is really just instructions for the experiments, and focus on the first 50-something pages of the paper. My short comments, 2 things, a general observation and then my own take on what I think I should care about this paper and this line of work. And the first observation is boy, experiments have gotten expensive. So if I've done the math right, we're somewhere in the mid 5-figure range, and I may underestimate this a little bit. And I very much hope for the experimental community that that's an outlier on the upper range somewhere. But money well spent. So this is, again, this is a really exciting paper. Think about it. Lab subjects, the social architects, the 2,000 mechanical Turkers, and general population samples. So there's a lot that goes into this paper. Why do I think I should care about this paper or this line of work? As an applied economist, I'm not seeing social choice theory papers on a daily basis, but I think I should care about this line of work in this paper and also other papers in this session, because they help me better understand questions of institutional design, and I think they help me better, or to help me design better institutions. I can think of this in a normative way. If I were an institutional designer and I have to give a decision maker, my social architect, some rules, some guidelines as to how to aggregate those preferences, from a normative standpoint, I would just give them the rule that I think is the best, or that I would prefer the most. But what if I can't do that? What if that's not available? What if for some reason I cannot be as clear and as decisive in the rule making that I give? What if my social architects have a little bit of discretion, a little bit of leeway? I would want to understand how they aggregate the preferences, how they make these decisions, what kind of rules they follow. And I just want to briefly mention 3 examples. One's from finance. So standard finance theory would suggest that you should focus on shareholder value. But there are now more recent developments where CEOs should promote interests of all stakeholders. That's also customers, employees, and so forth. So we get more diverse interests, we get more diverse stakeholders for which a decision maker, the social architect, namely the CEO, has to make these decisions. If I'm now an institutional designer, say I'm the board, or say I'm the legislature that has to decide how to design corporate law, I would want to better understand, okay, absent clear rules, what is it the CEOs will do? Because from a firm perspective, that would help me make better decisions when it comes to executive compensation, for instance. I get a better understanding, idea of, okay, what is the effect of my CEO's decisions on the shareholders and those that actually make those executive compensation decisions. And the same is true for the legislature. Well, how should we then design the rules and the laws that govern executive compensation? A second example comes from, for instance, competition policy. Again, some recent discussion about why sustainability should be part or should be an objective in competition policy. The German Federal Cartel Office just had a roundtable about this last year and wrote a white paper. Again, if we were to take this to the one step further, that would suggest we have more diverse stakeholders now in the game. It's not just the consumers and the producers in this question of what's the optimal welfare standard when it, for instance, comes to merger control, but we'd also have the environment, we have diversity, we have future generations. If we give the bureaucrats and the competition agencies a little bit of leeway and sort of let them make their own decisions, give them more discretion, again, as an institutional designer, the legislature, I would want to understand, okay, what is it? What can I expect these bureaucrats to do? What can I expect them? What kind of rules should I expect them to implement? And that should, again, help me design better institutions. My last example is the third example. I can think of it as also in terms of litigation when I give my juries instructions, procedural rules, especially in class action lawsuits, where with class action lawsuits, we often have thousands, hundreds of thousands of plaintiffs. They all come with somewhat diverse interests. What is the kind of rule my decision maker here that the court, the judge, or the jury would implement? I hand it back to you, Wolfgang. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I was just told that we need to stop the recording because the session is over, I think a couple of minutes ago already. So let me on the record thank all of the presenters, and also thank you very much to all of the discussants. We have 30 minutes after the recording is stopped, or I think after 45 deadline was the original deadline, to keep on discussing. But of course, like in a regular conference, I would say if anybody needs to run away, just go, because the session is officially over. So thank you everybody for attending the session. Thank you for the discussion and for all of the comments and for the excellent presentations.